you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
I used to use the analogy, look, if you're going to study geology, you go where the rocks are. You don't stay in a classroom. If you're going to study urban poverty, if you're going to study injustice, all those kinds of issues, you better go where they are and learn about them. And you don't come in as somebody who has answers. You come in as a learner.
I have today signed an executive order providing for the establishment of a Peace Corps on a temporary pilot basis. I'm also sending to Congress a message proposing authorization of a permanent Peace Corps.
And the Peace Corps was started in 1961, and there was lots of fanfare because Shriver was a member of the Kennedy family, and of course he had all the support he needed to do something that hadn't been done before, and certainly in that way. So I was assistant dean of the college. I'd come back in 1960 to work as Thad Seymour's assistant in the dean's office. And at registration, and I believe this was registration in, maybe it may have been January of 1961, something like that, I put on a little piece of paper, and it said, this entity, the Peace Corps, is being started and involves service overseas for 2 years. Do you think this is something that might interest you? And I had a yes or no or maybe or something like that. And so I remember with all those little pieces of paper, subsequently they came back to me from registration and went through them all and tallied them. And about 850 of, perhaps Dartmouth was 2,500 at that time, all male, said, yeah, they'd be interested. And so I said, well, what do I do with this? So I just sent it down to Washington. I just sent the tally. And it wasn't long after my phone rings and somebody's saying, well, Dean Dey, we have those results from registration at Dartmouth, and we think that we'd very much like to come up and talk with you about Dartmouth might be a very good place for recruitment. And it turned out these were two senior, Harris Wofford, who is a right-hand person for Sergeant Shriver. He'd been dean of law school at Notre Dame, and then Bill Delano, who was the legal counsel. These were senior deputies of Shriver. Next thing I know, they come to Hanover. I show them around and introduce them to students, and they're talking. They were here, and they spent the night. And the next day before they leave, on their way out of town, they turned to me and they said, well, would you be willing to go? And I said, me? I said, oh, come on, I have a wife, I have a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. And no, I had no thought of going. And they said, well, Sarge thinks that what he needs in the field are college deans, people who've had experience with the unexpected and crisis and working with young people. And he would really like for you to consider this.
The course called the Great Issues Course. And in the course, you got out of your own little niche in the fraternity and the rah-rah-rah of the campus and the football season and everything else, and you began to get an idea that there was something going on in the world outside of Hanover and outside of the United States.
I was undecided. I was restless. Had a certain instinct to explore, not interested in traditional choices. And a Peace Corps recruiter came to campus, and I decided to apply. Essentially, we spent 4 years in Hanover. There were no terms outside the country.
I was a sociology major. At best, I had some vague idea about community development as saving the world.
I was an international government major, so I had this international interest very early on. Probably my biggest activity outside of studying here was women's soccer, and I was actually the co-captain of the first women's soccer team at Dartmouth. So, spent time playing intramurals freshman year, and then we started a club, and then by senior year we had varsity status.
I was involved in the Tucker Foundation. I did volunteer work, and I think one of the things that got me thinking about eventually when the Peace Corps entered my radar in my senior year is the fact that I had all these opportunities to travel and to experience other cultures while I was at Dartmouth.
I was a biochemistry and molecular biology major, so initially I wanted to go to medical school, got the science related major, but also had the opportunity to take languages and other all the other classes that Dartmouth has to offer outside of strictly sticking to the biochemistry.
I was at the career fair over at the top of the hop, and had the great fortune of meeting a recruiter there, learned about the Peace Corps and the opportunity to not only work abroad, but to really live abroad. And I knew that international development, building off of my geography major, was the career path that I wanted to take. And thinking about that, I figured what better way to do it than through the Peace Corps. I also knew that I would really have the chance to really work at the grassroots level, which during my geography studies became incredibly clear that that's kind of the foundation for success when it comes to international projects.
My senior year, I got a grant from the anthropology department to study to do an ethnographic study in Ireland on the border, looking at border identities. From the 4 months that I spent in Ireland, I really wanted more that kind of travel, living among different people, learning their stories. The challenge of another culture and living in another country.
I was always very aware that I wasn't complete in some way, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And walking into College Common Ground and seeing things like Habitat for Humanity, which I had always wanted to do but never done, I realized like this was what the point of the Tucker Foundation was, and this was probably what I had been missing my previous 2 terms at Dartmouth. So I signed up for a lot of things, didn't get to do them all, but made up my mind that I would do volunteer work in some way. And it was also during that spring that I decided that I wanted to do an international volunteer trip.
My understanding of the history of the foundation was an article that John Sloan Dickey, then Dartmouth president, had written for the Atlantic Monthly, and it was entitled Competence and Conscience. And the thesis was that this country's liberal arts colleges had been started primarily for religious purposes, and the presidents tended to be theologians. Dartmouth, the last president who was a minister was William Jewett Tucker at the turn of the century, probably from the late 1800s to maybe until 1908 or 10. John Dickey was concerned because throughout the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, these institutions were becoming increasingly secularized. And how were these institutions to manifest their concern for issues of conscience? And that's why he wrote that article. And he and the then Board of Trustees created an entity which was to represent and carry through in the spirit of serving humanity, of leading not only useful lives, and that can be broadly defined, but in ways beyond self. And John Dickey felt very strongly about that commitment to service. I would be counseling them about a program in East Africa, a program in Malaya, that sort of thing, but I didn't really know what it was like. And here I am, in some ways, encouraging young people to do that and go into the unknown. And what am I doing giving that advice, sitting in Parkhurst Hall on the first floor? And so my wife and I both thought about that, and we'd always done everything together. And we said, yeah, we ought to do this. And so we said yes.
Even after 3 years in the Marine Corps, I didn't think that there was enough that I had really done. He first broached the idea when he was campaigning at the University of Michigan, I think, and he gave that speech. And I remember reading about that speech saying that would be a fantastic idea if he ever does that.
There was a spirit that was coming alive through people that talked about what Peace Corps could be. So we definitely, were in the first wave, and there weren't former volunteers to talk to about what the experience actually was. So we were people who just took the leap, and about 12 or 13 of my classmates became volunteers.
I was a Kennedy kid, and the assassination of Kennedy had a huge impact on me and many, many others of my generation. And I was, affected by his call for people to go into service. Second issue was I really didn't have anything better to do, anything that I was much more interested in. Third, I had a big interest in seeing the world, and I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, but Peace Corps seemed to be a way to do it. And the fourth one, which in some ways may be the most important, is that the Peace Corps in those early days of the Peace Corps sent a very attractive young lady up to Dartmouth to be their recruiter, and we ended up having a very nice long conversation one evening, and that led to an application, and the application ultimately led to a letter saying, "Would you, we'd like you to go to Bolivia," and that led me to go look at a map and figure out where Bolivia was.
When I applied to the Peace Corps, I did not know a single other human being that had been in the Peace Corps. I didn't know anyone at Dartmouth. I'd never talked to anyone that had been in the Peace Corps, but I was of that age where I actually remember, I was just old enough to remember President Kennedy announcing it, and I can tell you the exact time where I was when they landed on the moon and where I was when President Kennedy announced the Peace Corps. And I'm going to get emotional about it. Because that was really important to me.
I mentioned a few of the other places I had interviewed with, and I mentioned the Peace Corps. And the interviewer said, "You know, that's such a unique experience, the Peace Corps. You know, I really think if that's something you're considering and that's you know, something you're interested in, that perhaps that's what you should do." And I remember kind of thinking that my interviewer is telling me this, and this kind of means that he's not going to hire me.
I knew that if I wanted to go to medical school, that's a long road ahead of me, and I really wanted to do something more adventurous and something more exciting and give back with my time before going to medical school. So I decided to join the Peace Corps, and I was very set on leaving as soon as I graduated.
I remember sitting in my futon with the law school applications that I put aside to the right, and picking up the phone and kind of nervously calling my mom and saying, "Mom, kind of have a change of heart. And I think I want to serve in the Peace Corps and think about law school maybe further down the road, but I actually want to work and live in the communities because this is what I'm about." And she took a deep breath, and I heard her, and she finally said, she's like, "You know, I think this is a good decision. You've always made good decisions. You trusted me going to Dartmouth, and so I'll trust you serving in the Peace Corps. And when you got Mom's seal of approval, you're pretty much set to go."
I like to tell people that the real reason I joined Peace Corps was waking up Saturday mornings and watching the Muppets, I think it was, and every Saturday morning they'd have the commercial for the Peace Corps. And at the end of the commercial, it would show the symbol of Peace Corps and it'd say, "The toughest job you'll ever love." And that, for some reason, that really stuck with me.
I was away for 3 times my junior year, and one of the places I went was I did an FSB in Morocco, and I got a chance to meet some of the Moroccan volunteers, Peace Corps volunteers, and just talking to them about why they wanted to do this, why they were doing it, how it was like to be doing this life of service. I think it reinforced even more for me that that was my vocation.
That May, June, they sent me down to Puerto Rico where there was a training camp, and my wife was in New Jersey with our grandparents and the kids getting our shots, and she told our 2 daughters that, "Now this doesn't hurt, you know, Mommy will go first," and they gave her a shot, and she passed out, and the oldest one said, "You've killed my mommy."
Peace Corps training in 1963 was like throwing us like spaghetti against the wall to see what stuck.
A group that went with me trained as they were qualified diesel mechanics, and Tunisia is build a highway like that with 4th labor intensive rather than bringing a Caterpillar diesel in. So these volunteers were sitting in the different cities throughout Tunisia with nothing to do.
Graduation was early June, and a week later I was in Lincoln, Nebraska, being trained to go to Bolivia.
We learned to slit the throats of chickens, gut a cow, ride horses, We had to go through intensive psychological interviews, T-group sensitivity training, peer evaluations, aptitude tests. Our arms were pincushions for vaccinations. They pulled wisdom teeth. They did everything. We had Navy drown proofing.
Very much like being in camp.
And then there was sex education, in which we were told about a new drug called no-acetol. And if the urge was too strong, the advice was be safe as the instructor pulled a condom over a broomstick.
We had really good language training. It was an early version of the Rassias method of doing language training before the Rassias method existed, as far as I know.
Boom! June 1964. A flood of humanity comes to Dartmouth. It was tsunami all over the place. People walking in with their bags, valises, backpacks, curious, wondering what's going to happen next, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. After they settled the bags in, we had a big call at one of the rooms at Dartmouth, one of the big rooms, and I explained to them what was going to happen, and I said, now, as you leave this room, I want each of you to take a pill and a little glass of water and drink it. Put the pill in the water and drink it. Matter of fact, I'd like to see you do it right now. So everybody stood up, we gave them cups of water, little glasses, and put pills in them. And I said, and these are what we're going to call the revolution of language. So with this drink, you'll automatically learn language. So unto you, we go, cheers, cheers, pop the bottles in, and that was the way we launched the program. So it is a question of rhythm, which involves a kind of a dance, and what happens ultimately is that the choreography is the message. And if I'm going around the room flapping my finger and aiming at, looking at somebody here and then snapping at you and looking at you, you get startled and you become awake and you start to speak. I keep looking at you, now suddenly I snap at you and I point here, then I look, boom, and that person is up and acting. So this is why the movement like that, this is what makes it work. It's a dance, it's a song, it's a sing, it's a commitment, it's love, it's embracing. There's no error. Nobody ever is guilty of making a mistake. We banish the word wrong. No, what we say, almost, keep moving along. So no one is ever depressed, no one is ever ignored, everyone's caught off guard, and that's when you learn. Because if you're waiting for me to hit you with a snap like this, oh man, you better be awake. And in some cases, they needed a hell of a lot of brushing up and building up. And this thing was incredible. And many, many times I would go by the language laboratory then and see them working at 3 a.m. and some sleeping on the floor to get back in the morning and go into breakfast and then start the course again. And then you have another 8 hours straight out, and at the end of the 8 hours, then you have culture night. They put it on plays, little psychodramas. The place was always moving. It was beat, beat, beat. And this is the kind of thing that, again, drove the engine all the time. And they stayed with us until about the end of June, July, August. I think it was the end of August, early September.
And the rest of the training was nonsensical. We had professors who would stand up and say, well, I don't know anything about Bolivia. I'm actually an expert in wheat in Turkey, but and then give his wheat in Turkey speech.
We did no training here. We all met in Seattle, and we had 3 days where we got vaccines and kind of an introduction from the director of the Korea Peace Corps program who came over to meet us. We lived with families from day one when we got to the country. We had a lot of kind of university graduates, very bright Koreans who came up to this training site. We trained in a town that was not too far south of the DMZ. And then the last day at the end of 8 weeks, we all sat in a circle and they had a big map of Korea up on the board. And they pulled our names out of the hat one at a time to give us our assignments of where we were going to spend the next, at that time, 2 years of our lives.
They just threw that out there. I think they needed beekeepers, and it was a good fit for liberal arts graduates, I suppose. And then we were shipped from Frogmore, South Carolina to Zaire because I had to learn French. I didn't know French. From there, we were sent to the Central African Republic, and we had to do Sango trainings.
Just after graduation, less than a month later, I left for the Gambia in West Africa. Went through my 3 months of training in the Gambia, learning the language and things about the Department of Health. I was a health extension volunteer, and part of my focus in the Peace Corps, one of the reasons why I wanted to go to the Peace Corps, was to do HIV prevention work.
Every trainee lives with a family, a Salvadoran family, for the first 12 weeks. And I practiced my Spanish, was ready to go and introduce myself, and I stood there and gave my host mom a hug, and Niña Tita was her name, and I told her, "Estoy bien embarazada de estar aquí," which I thought meant I was incredibly excited to be here, and instead I had actually said, "I'm very pregnant and I'm here." Training, needless to say, was full of tons of laughs, but tons of challenges as well. I rode in on a pickup truck, on the back of a pickup truck, down to San Vicente, and literally spent probably 3 hours in the morning working on the Spanish language, and then the rest of the day was primarily dedicated to a combination of technical training, which taught me about a number of different things: organic composting, how to do natural pest control in El Salvador, because these were the tasks that environmental educators were going to be asked to do.
It's a strange experience when you land in another country. You've been there for about a week, and you're put with this family, and you're told, okay, well, they're gonna take care of you. They're gonna feed you. They're gonna help you learn Bulgarian. So there you go. We had a language instructor with us, and so we'd meet every day for about 8 hours, I'd say. And by the end of the 3 months, I had a pretty good understanding of Bulgarian. I had a pretty good understanding of being a teacher and a pretty good understanding of the culture. And at the end of the 3 months, they sent us away to our permanent sites.
The purpose of the Peace Corps in the Philippines was to, in those days they used language, rescue the English language. One of the major problems was they'd get to the school and the principal wouldn't have a foggy idea what to do with them.
I was a physical education instructor in Tunisia for a year. Their needs were at a different level than I was prepared to give.
Essentially, I was rolled out of a Jeep, introduced to an 80-year-old mayor. I expected to find a place to sleep and eat, and they said, "See you in 2 years, adios." So with the mayor's help, I spent the first night on a cot in the Catholic church on the plaza. And my first 2 weeks were kind of lying on a cot as if I were in an open casket with every curious kid in town coming to pay respects.
I was assigned to a village where I was supposed to work with a cooperative of chicken farmers. And by the time I got to that village, the cooperative had disintegrated. That's really very symptomatic of the way the Peace Corps was in those days, and led me to try and figure out, what can I do?
It was about 7 p.m. or so when I walked down that main street with my address in my hand, trying to find this health center, because that's the only address I had. I didn't have a place to live. I didn't know anyone. All I had was an address. And I'm walking into town about 7 o'clock at night, and I found the health center. Of course, they're closed, but they had this tradition where 2 men every night would stand watch. But when I was showing them this address and trying to talk to them, I felt I was pretty proud. I had kind of scored pretty well on my Foreign Service test exam that they give you at the end of Peace Corps in your language, and I love languages. Dartmouth was great for training people in languages, and I was feeling really good. And I go down there and found they spoke a very different dialect on this island, and I could hardly understand a word they said.
You get dressed up, you go to the embassy, you do your swear-in as a Peace Corps, you take the oath, and then you have a little party, and then very quickly they put you in a truck and you go off to your post. I was put there right in the heart of beekeeping season, and I did have some beekeeping expertise, but I was just trying to figure out what to do at that point, and was kind of going out to different villages, trying to meet the beekeepers, finding out what they did, what project I might take. And then before I knew it, sort of the beekeeping season was ending, and I had lost a year.
My placement within the country was in one of the areas that had the highest HIV rates in the country. So there was a long adjustment time period of just getting to know what's going on in the community, who the leaders are, who are the right people to talk to if you want to get something done, and just building up that respect.
I spent my first night sleeping in a hammock when they showed me to my house, and it was the hottest night of my life. And I remember waking up the next morning thinking, now what? Now what do I do? And so Don Luis took me down to the school and he introduced me to all the teachers, and the students immediately stood up as soon as I stepped foot in the door. And I didn't know if I was supposed to stop walking, if I was supposed to continue walking, what I was actually supposed to do.
I got into my apartment, I put down my stuff. It was about dinner time, so I started making dinner, and I just sat down. I was thinking, okay, well, here I am now. I'm a Peace Corps volunteer. It's official. I have my own place. I have my assignment, but I really don't know what to do.
Dartmouth students I knew who wanted to serve, I felt they were well grounded and they wanted to serve for the right reasons. So one of the things I would be saying is these weren't young people who were fleeing from something. Oh, well, I couldn't succeed at anything, or you're off to find yourself. We found out an awful lot about ourselves, certainly beginning with me and my family when we were over there. I was known as a field representative, and so I was responsible for 80 volunteers in southern Luzon, Albay province, and the 80 volunteers were scattered over maybe 200 square miles, maybe more. They were on islands, and it would take me months to visit each one.
I went to Gabon, and we built school. We hired workers, and the treasurer of the city that I was working, he was padding the payroll. We were paying the workers, the United States government, to help us build the schools. But you step back and you say, there are 30 schools in that country that weren't there before.
So where my motivation had been a sense of adventure, now my drive was to become useful and to make a difference in some small way to how they lived and what they might look forward to. Over time, we succeeded in bringing medical services to town. And then we decided to build a clinic. And we also started a cooperative in the town. From that, we expanded to do some regional collective action, combining with volunteers in other towns for digging wells and building roads. And that became the foundation of a social movement, which got quite large.
I guess it was like a graduate course in community development, and something that I eventually understood I was actually fairly good at, and that coincided with a national program that was funded by USAID, and I was sort of co-opted by USAID and the Peace Corps and the Bolivian agency that was doing this community development program to help move the program or expand the program from the Altiplano to the Cochabamba Valley, and kind of get a real experiential course in the sociology and anthropology of Bolivia.
We were actually terminated early, so we didn't get our full 2 years of service in because Reagan came in and said, I'm cutting the Peace Corps budget, and there were 4 countries where the last groups were there, and so that's how they made the decision. So I only got about 14 months of service with the Peace Corps instead of my 24 months. And I could have been reassigned to another country and continued on with Peace Corps, but at that point, the language, an interesting side reason I went to a country other than where I would be speaking English, I really wanted to learn another language. And I'd invested so much time and energy in learning the culture and learning the language and learning about tuberculosis and the patients. I developed relationships with the patients that I took care of on this island. I mean, I was the main tuberculosis person responsible for patients in a population of 200,000 people. And you really get to know those individual patients. You visit them in their homes. You know their stories. They see you coming up the path to their house, and they were just so gracious and wonderful and warm. And those personal relationships meant a lot. And I just didn't want to leave. So instead of relocating to another Peace Corps country, I found a job on the same island, and I was able to stay there another almost 2 years by working in the shipbuilding industry.
I left after 1 year. I was finding that just too many endemic problems with the whole beekeeping project. It was just very difficult when there was no market to try to create a market. I was offered another village, a reassignment to a different village. However, I felt that the problems with the beekeeping program and the Peace Corps, just that whole program of apiculture in that particular country were so deep, I didn't think it would really resolve anything for me.
I was paired with the community health nurse, and the health infrastructure in the Gambia, there's a few main hospitals, but then throughout the country there are community health nurses. So the Department of Health provides them with a motorcycle to be able to get from the village that they're posted out to these outposted areas. The Peace Corps gave me a bicycle. So I would leave a little bit earlier, and we'd both get to the village on time. But by the end of 2 years, after I did have malaria and the dysentery and all that other fun stuff, you really become so integrated in your community that it's hard to think about leaving. And all of those things that were hard to learn the first time are now part of your daily routine. Actually at the end of 2 years, I didn't leave. I stayed for a third year. I did a lot of the HIV prevention work, and then a huge major hospital opened nearby after I'd been there for about a year. So I used to go and see what they needed around the hospital, what I could do. And one of the things that I noticed is that they had all these shortages of medicine. They had all types of records being kept, all these logbooks being kept, but no one was actually looking at the data. And no one was actually looking at how many cases of malaria do we have in a month, and do we have enough medication for that number of cases of malaria. And so one of the things that I did with my third year there was actually move to the hospital and really work on their data systems.
The majority of my work as a Peace Corps volunteer, while it was environmentally centered, really focusing on working with youth as well. But when I thought about closing my service, I knew that I didn't really want to leave yet. I knew that the work that I had done had kind of come to its own conclusion, and quite honestly, the community itself was able to continue the work that we had started. Didn't end up extending as a volunteer, but ended up extending kind of subtly, working directly with Peace Corps trainees. But when I finally left the country in 2007, after working as a technical trainer for a year, it was really hard. It was incredibly hard, and a lot of tears were shed. I went back to my community, and we did what's called a despedida, where they see you off and they send you off, and it was hard.
I just started remedial English, starting from the very beginning and trying to build the students up throughout the year. It was a mining town, very low on the economic ladder. I had applied for funding to do a community project, and the funding had been accepted. The project was basically a multimedia room for the classroom, where kids could go in different subjects with their class teacher. Part of it was also in collaboration with the city, so that if the city had classes, for example, or different kinds of training, they could use this classroom during the weekends or during evenings for that kind of training. I stayed for an additional year to teach at an American university there in Bulgaria. There were a few reasons. I wanted to see if teaching was something that I wanted to continue doing. I met a girl there in Bulgaria who I later married and is now my wife.
John Dickey was feeling there has to be a shortcut. He took me to lunch, and rather than having a national search, asked if I would become dean of the Tucker Foundation. I had been involved in counseling students about service projects, had gone off with my family for a Peace Corps stint so that I would know more about what it was like to serve overseas, and had been involved in service programs here, particularly the integration of first private secondary schools and then public secondary schools. And so it made sense. Wonderful time to have such a position, because all the issues that were being addressed nationally, and of course the most prominently the Vietnam War, but issues of race and the Civil Rights Acts had been passed, but then the implementation, of course, was so difficult. Johnson's war on poverty, that excessive language, but his heart was in the right place.
And I remember thinking, God, it would be great if I could bring all of them back to America, because they're such wonderful kids. 30 years later, my wife and I, along with another couple, started the I Have a Dream program in Hartford, one of 3. and we sponsored a group of kids in the 6th grade and told them we'd pay their way through college. We'd assist with their college tuition if they graduated from high school. The names were different, but they were basically the same kind of spirit and faces on the kids that I'd left behind in Tunisia.
What we saw coming back was the racism and bigotry that was just below the surface of the ideals we knew growing up. As Peace Corps volunteers who had been involved in social change, we were particularly sensitive to that reality that we found at home. And we became activists for change, even as students. So I co-founded Action for Human Rights at the University of Michigan and was involved both in civil rights and peace demonstrations.
One of the very most basic messages of the experience in Bolivia and Panama is that you got to take people in the world and communities where they are, not where you think they are or where you want them to be, and move from there. That sort of philosophy and worldview turned out to be very useful in the work that I'm doing now. Really has one of the highest incidence of uninsured people in the state. It has one of the highest incidence of people below 200% of poverty, and of course it historically a center for migrant farm workers. Typically uninsured people. This van served as the clinic and the counseling room and the reception area. It goes out 2-3 days a week in the summertime to the camps where migrant farm workers live and provides on-site healthcare services, medical and dental. It is healthcare without questions asked.
But I never, ever could have imagined how that Peace Corps experience would have any connection to my later life the way it has. I still go to high schools and talk about the Peace Corps experience. I'll usually split my time talking half the time about what I do now, which is healthcare consulting, and then, part of the time talking about Peace Corps. And quite frankly, it's when I get to talking about Peace Corps that the eyes in the room light up. My youngest son recently, through our church group, went down to the Dominican Republic, and he came back. Finally, I tuck him into bed, and I walk down the hall, and he says, "Mom," I'm like, "Yeah." He said, "Can you come back here?" So I go back, and he says, "Mom, I know how important Peace Corps was to you. And after working with these Peace Corps volunteers in the DR, I've decided that I want to go into the Peace Corps."
Though the Peace Corps for me was an abbreviated experience, I have to say it's had a major impact on my life. Having worked in economic development in Africa and having been enmeshed in poverty, I became very interested in economic development as an academic field. And I did actually go to graduate school and study public policy and international planning. I currently work for the Department of Youth and Community Development, and I was working on an anti-poverty program that was designed to put young, disconnected youth into jobs or back into education or into training programs to try to help the communities and help them get on a career path. I got very involved in the Returned Peace Corps group of New York City. I met my future wife in that group. She was a Returned Peace Corps volunteer from Albania, and there was a coup. And I went to the bathroom and I came back and I found out she was now president of the group.
I left the Peace Corps after my 3rd year, and I moved to London, and I got a master's degree in public health. And I think my time working as a health volunteer in the Peace Corps helped show me that some of my strengths were in organizing and some of the data management, and not in the actual patient-provider interaction. And since that time, I've been here in the Bronx working at one of the first adolescent HIV programs in the country, working with a variety of different projects and different program management for prevention for HIV negative youth, as well as linkage to care for HIV positive youth. And I also do a lot of data management, which is kind of goes across the board for our prevention programs and our clinical programs. So it's really interesting that even though I was all the way in Africa doing HIV prevention, there's a lot of epicenters here in the United States, and there's a lot of work to be done here as well as abroad.
When I finished my service, the only reason I could logically rationalize leaving El Salvador was to continue my studies. So I went actually, I left in August and started my graduate studies in September up in Boston at Harvard. And my trajectory in grad school was very much defined by my service as a volunteer. I realized how critical education was in particular, and so I did a master's in international education policy. You know, I love working in the international realm, but being from South Carolina, it's also really important to me to give back to the domestic community as well. So I started working for a national nonprofit that outreaches to under-resourced communities, trying to create opportunities for kids to flourish and develop. I spent 2 years there and loved it, and grew tremendously, but of course still missed the international world. So I made my way back to Peace Corps and joined on as the diversity outreach specialist here at Peace Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. And there's not a better job that I can imagine, honestly. It's an opportunity to really think about Peace Corps service and making sure that everyone here in the United States, folks that come from all different walks of life, are truly aware of the tremendous experience that the Peace Corps can be, and letting them know that should they choose to pursue it, it's one that will not, certainly will not sell them short, because there's so much to be gained. But yeah, 2 years, a year in grad school, 2 years working for a national nonprofit trying to get back here stateside, and back on the international side working for Peace Corps.
I kind of saw firsthand what it's like to live in a country without a very strong legal system. My wife and I lived in in a larger town than where I was before, but it was still, you know, had the small town feel. And even though she was Bulgarian but was from a different town, if we had a problem, we couldn't go to the police because the police would always take the side of the locals there. And so kind of living in that kind of experience, in that kind of situation, made me really want to study law back in the States. And, you know, it sounds dramatic, I guess, but make sure something like that never happens here. So from that, it kind of made me interested in criminal law, especially, and that's part of what I study here. So that's how Peace Corps made me want to become a lawyer.
Since 1961, we've had over 600 Dartmouth alumni who have also served as Peace Corps volunteers. Over the past year, we had 17 Dartmouth alumni who are currently serving, which has really kind of helped Dartmouth maintain its status as one of our top colleges. It's currently ranked 12th. And I am very optimistic that it'll continue to move up the rankings because the individuals tend to be very successful. They have a level of sensitivity, a cross-cultural sensitivity that you really need. Our mission has remained constant and steady and extremely relevant over the past 50 years because at the core it's about world peace and friendship. I encourage and I challenge Dartmouth to be a part of that, to really look at how it can continue to get the word out on our behalf and encourage its students to continue to care about the world beyond their backyard. 27 months is a very short period of time, but there's an enormous impact that you can have within 27 months, not just on the communities in which benefit from you being there, but also really it's the impact that you have on your own thinking. And I see that in our Peace Corps volunteers that come back. They really are changed, and they have a different perspective around how they interact with the world and the impact that they can have on the world.
It was Africa, but it was Africa in a different way than I had ever known it. And I remember my friend and I traveled to the Western Sahara trying to be explorers as everybody else went to, like, you know, exotic places for a break that we had. And I met a UN peacekeeper who was from Ghana, and she was basically the first female Ghanaian UN peacekeeper to leave Ghana and come anywhere. And she said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Accra." And she said, the question Ghanaians will usually ask is, "Who is your family?" And I mentioned my grandmother, and she was a nurse, this UN peacekeeper. She said, "Your grandmother taught me." And if I had ever doubted that I would do the Peace Corps, that what I was doing was my grandmother's path and what she would have hoped for from me, I think that experience, who would have thought the Western Sahara, to meet someone who knew my grandmother, and she spent hours just raving about the woman that she was and how radical she was, which I never knew, that she was a radical. And I remember thinking, my God, she is telling me that I need to do this. And I knew that the Peace Corps was basically what I needed to do. It's great because 2 years isn't a lifetime, and I think you need a lifetime to make any type of change. But if I can spend those 2 years even solidifying something that people can continue, those every single 2 years added together can be that lifetime for those people who will be served. And that's what I hope to do when I go. Dartmouth has afforded me many experiences, and so while I think if you had asked me sophomore year, I would have told you this place is not for me. It will never be my space. I think what it has given me is the strength to push forward and find and make a space for myself. And if nothing else, I think it's the greatest gift this institution has given me.
Language Professor John Rassias. I want to present a certificate of appreciation for all that he has done for the Peace Corps.
This spirit will grow, that hundreds of others of young Americans and older Americans will go overseas to show our best side, to show how much we desire to live at peace. There can be no greater service to our country, and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States.